When I noticed my husband standing in the doorway, holding my work bag, my pulse stopped for a single beat. He wasn't looking at me, he was looking at the contents spilling out across the kitchen table. The receipt from that out-of-town restaurant, the pen with the company logo I had never brought home before, and, worst of all, the small hotel key card that should have stayed hidden at the bottom of my purse. His fingers turned the card over like it was evidence in a trial he didn't know he was part of, his brow creased, his mouth set in a line too tight for words. "What's this?" he finally asked, his voice quieter than I expected, too quiet. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words tangled, heavy and clumsy, as if my tongue had forgotten how to form excuses. I could feel my heartbeat pounding behind my ears, drowning out the ticking of the wall clock, the hum of the refrigerator, even his breathing. The air between us felt sharp, like glass. My hand twitched toward the table, instinctively, to snatch the card away, but I stopped halfway. His gaze shifted to me, steady and piercing, and I knew he was putting the pieces together. Not all of them, not yet, but enough. I wanted to shout that it wasn't what it looked like, that there was more to the story, that the truth was both simpler and more complicated than any scene he might imagine. But my throat tightened. The silence stretched until it felt unbearable. And as I stood there, rooted in place, I thought of the moment everything started, the first day, the first look, the first sign that my life was about to change in ways I couldn't undo. 3 months ago, I made a mistake. The kind of mistake that creeps into your life like a shadow you don't notice until it's too late. Before I explain, before I tell you everything I've been hiding, answer me this: have you ever kept a secret so carefully, only to watch it slip right through your hands? I never thought of my marriage as broken. Stale, maybe, like bread left out on the counter overnight, still edible, but far from fresh. We had routines instead of conversations, habits instead of laughter. He would rise early for his jog, coffee already brewing by the time I shuffled into the kitchen. We would exchange a morning or a quiet nod, a kiss on the cheek if we remembered, and then scatter into our separate days. It wasn't unhappy, not in the loud, fighting kind of way. It was quieter than that, a stillness that settled in and hardened over the years. And maybe, for a while, I thought that stillness was normal. Or that it was enough. I worked as a secretary in a department that rarely made waves. My days were full of schedules, emails, and the rhythm of tapping keys. It was predictable in a way that once felt comforting, then gradually dulled into something like sleepwalking. Until the day he arrived, the new department head, the man who would unravel that stillness like it was never really solid to begin with. He didn't walk into the office the way others did, sliding quietly into place. He filled the room. Not just because of his voice, warm and measured, or the way he smiled when introducing himself to each of us, like we mattered individually. It was the attention, direct, unhurried. When he shook my hand, his eyes stayed on mine, holding just a little longer than expected. I told myself it was nothing. Of course I did. New management always stirs things up, makes people alert, alive for a while. But something in me flickered awake that I hadn't realized had dimmed. I caught myself smoothing my blouse, sitting up straighter when he walked past my desk. Harmless, I thought. Completely harmless. The first week, we spoke only about work. The new filing system, the budget meeting, the inevitable chaos of reorganizing a team. But there were small things, tiny, almost invisible shifts, that unsettled me more than they should have. The way he remembered I took my coffee without sugar, the way his voice softened slightly when he said my name, like he was testing it, tasting it. At home, I tried to describe my new boss to my husband over dinner. I mentioned the reorganization, the changes, the fact that I'd be staying late a few nights to help. He nodded absently, chewing, his eyes fixed on the TV in the next room. "Good for you," he said. And that was it. He didn't ask more. He didn't even look up. The first late night at the office was nothing unusual. Or at least, it wasn't supposed to be. Stacks of reports, a printer that jammed every third page, the hum of fluorescent lights. Most people left by 6, by 7, the hallways were empty, shadows pooling in the corners. He stayed too. "No sense making you clean this mess up alone," he'd said with a half smile, rolling up his sleeves. We worked side by side, the office quiet except for the shuffle of papers and the occasional, shared sigh. At one point, our hands brushed when we reached for the same stack of folders. A simple thing, fleeting, but my breath caught anyway. I told myself I imagined the way his hand lingered a fraction of a second too long. Driving home that night, the city lights blurring through my windshield, I realized I was smiling. Not the polite smile I wore at PTA meetings or when neighbors waved. A different smile, small, private, unexplainable. The next morning, I found myself checking the mirror twice, changing my earrings before work. Nothing dramatic, nothing anyone else would notice. But I noticed. Another evening, another late night. My husband didn't question it, he was used to my overtime by then, or maybe he just didn't want to know the details. We worked quietly again, the conversation drifting from tasks to trivial things, the music playing faintly from his phone, the books we loved as teenagers, the places we'd always wanted to see. There was nothing scandalous in those words. But it felt dangerous. Not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. At home, lying in bed, I listened to my husband's even breathing beside me. I stared at the ceiling and wondered when I'd last felt a pulse of anticipation in my own life. Not just comfort, not just familiarity, something electric. The days blurred, one into another. But the shift had already happened, even if I pretended otherwise. I could feel it every time my phone buzzed with a work email and my heart leapt before I even saw his name. That was the beginning. Not the hotel key card, not the secrets spilling across the kitchen table, not even the kiss I'll tell you about soon. It began here, in the quiet, in the spaces between words. Long before anyone else could see it. Long before I admitted it to myself. The second week blurred into the first, but there was a difference now, a quiet shift in the way I carried myself into the office, in the way my hand hovered just a little longer on the doorframe before I walked in. It wasn't deliberate, not something I'd rehearsed, but I could feel the change. The air in the building felt charged somehow, like static waiting for a spark. He had a way of making the ordinary seem just slightly tilted, like everything was leaning toward something unnamed. By Tuesday, the overtime was already scheduled. "It's the quarterly reports," I'd told my husband, setting my keys on the counter as he scrolled through his phone. "They're a mess, and someone has to untangle them." He nodded without looking up. That nod meant more than I let myself admit. It was permission, and it was also distance. When the office emptied out again, the soundscape changed. No phones ringing, no printers spitting pages, no footsteps in the hallway. Just the low hum of the heater and the scratch of pens moving across paper. He leaned over my desk, his tie slightly loosened, and pointed out an error in a spreadsheet. "Here, this line doesn't add up." His voice was calm, even amused, and for some reason that tiny observation landed with more weight than it should have. We stayed like that for hours, working side by side, passing papers back and forth. I noticed things I hadn't noticed before, the way his sleeves were always rolled to the same point on his forearms, the way he tapped his pen against his palm when he was thinking. I wasn't studying him, not exactly. But I was noticing, and that was its own quiet danger. Midweek brought a strange interruption. He stopped by my desk earlier than usual, just before the office began to clear out for the night. "Would you be willing to grab dinner after we finish tonight?" "My treat," he said lightly, as if it were nothing, as if it were as simple as asking someone to pass the stapler. The hesitation I felt wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a storm of guilt or panic. It was a single beat, a pause where my mind searched for the right response and my heart beat just a fraction too hard. "Sure," I said, my voice casual. Too casual, probably. The hours that followed felt strange, suspended. My focus wavered, the numbers on the spreadsheets blurred. I caught myself glancing at the clock, counting down, as if something monumental waited at the other side of 8 p.m. By the time we left the building, the sky had darkened completely. The city was slick from a light rain, the streets reflecting the glow of traffic lights. The restaurant he chose was a quiet one, tucked between an antique shop and a pharmacy. It wasn't crowded. It wasn't fancy. That made it easier to breathe, and harder, all at once. We talked over dinner, the kind of talking that doesn't feel forced, the kind that drifts. We spoke of things that didn't matter, his favorite coffee, the way he hated mornings, the book I'd once read on a whim that had stayed with me. The conversations were harmless on the surface. But beneath, I felt the water pulling, a current I wasn't sure I could resist. When we left, the rain had returned, a soft drizzle that painted the pavement silver. I had parked down the street, and we walked together in silence, the sound of our footsteps the only thing between us. He paused under the overhang of a closed shop, his hand brushing against mine, not accidentally, not quite deliberately either. For a second, everything felt very still. The rain softened, the street around us emptied, and then, it happened. We kissed. It wasn't long, and it wasn't the kind of thing you could explain away as a mistake of proximity or bad timing. It was deliberate in its quietness. When we stepped apart, there was a beat where neither of us spoke. I drove home in silence, my fingers tight on the steering wheel, my reflection in the windshield blurred by the rain. At one stoplight, I caught myself pressing my thumb against my lips as if I could erase the sensation, or memorize it, or both at once. When I walked into the house, the smell of dinner still lingered faintly in the kitchen. My husband was at the table, reading, his glasses sliding down the bridge of his nose. He looked up when I entered and smiled, not the broad, delighted smile of years past, but a small, automatic one. "Long day?" he asked. I nodded, hanging up my coat. My voice felt strange in my throat when I answered, "Yes, very." That night, lying in bed, I stared into the dark. His breathing beside me was steady, comforting, and completely separate from my own. My mind circled back to that moment under the overhang, the rain tapping gently against the awning, the pause before the touch. I told myself I would draw a line, that I would step back before anything else happened. That this was only a moment, a single step that didn't have to lead anywhere. But deep down, a smaller, quieter voice whispered what I didn't want to hear, that sometimes a single step is all it takes to leave where you were standing behind forever. The day after the kiss felt strange in ways I hadn't expected. It wasn't that the sky looked different or that people spoke to me any differently, the mail still arrived late, the coffee machine still sputtered. But something inside me had shifted, and every ordinary thing seemed to highlight it. When I poured cereal that morning, my hand shook just enough for a few flakes to scatter across the counter. My husband noticed, but only to ask, "Did you sleep all right?" I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. At work, the familiar rhythm of the office felt unsteady. He wasn't there when I arrived, which both relieved me and unsettled me at the same time. I caught myself glancing toward his door, waiting to hear his voice. Each passing moment fed the restless churn inside me. When he finally walked in, later than usual, our eyes met for the briefest second. Just 1 second, but it seemed to hold more than a dozen conversations could. There was no smile, not the easy kind he'd given me before. But there was acknowledgement, and that alone made my pulse stutter. The day crawled. I typed reports, answered emails, sat in meetings, and all the while my thoughts pulled back to the night before. That moment in the rain felt both near and impossibly distant, like a dream you can still taste hours later but can't quite believe happened. By lunchtime, I had avoided looking directly at him for too long, and that avoidance felt obvious even to me. When I went to the break room, I could feel his presence even when he wasn't there. My hand trembled when I poured tea, and I cursed quietly under my breath, telling myself to stop. It was a kiss, I reasoned. Just a kiss. People make mistakes. People move on. But the thought didn't sit right. Mistake implied regret, and I wasn't sure I regretted it. Later that afternoon, he stopped by my desk, leaning against the edge as if nothing had changed. He spoke only about the quarterly figures, the revisions needed in one document. The conversation was brief, professional, almost too professional. But I caught the slight pause before he left, the way his hand lingered on the folder just a second longer than it needed to. That pause said more than words could. I realized I was starting to crave those small moments, the brush of a hand, the pause, the shared silence. That craving was a quiet thing, not loud or desperate, but it was there, shaping my day in ways I didn't want to admit. That evening, when I got home, the smell of dinner greeted me as usual. My husband was stirring a pot on the stove, humming softly to himself. He asked about my day, his voice warm but distracted. I answered automatically, each word carefully measured. I didn't mention the kiss. I didn't mention how my heart had been racing every time my phone buzzed, hoping it was him. After dinner, I stood at the sink washing dishes while my husband read in the living room. The sound of turning pages was steady, familiar, and for the first time, it felt distant. The quiet between us had always been a kind of comfort, but now it felt like a space I was filling with unspoken thoughts. In bed that night, I stared at the ceiling, my body heavy with exhaustion but my mind unwilling to rest. I thought about how easy it had been, how natural, how everything leading up to that kiss had felt like water rising inch by inch until suddenly I was submerged. The next morning, I told myself to reset. To draw that invisible line and hold it. At work, I stayed glued to my desk, focusing harder on the emails, the forms, the endless spreadsheets. He stayed in his office most of the day, and I was grateful for the distance, even as a small part of me hated it. But by late afternoon, I felt the air shift again. He appeared in the doorway of my workspace, holding 2 coffee cups. "Thought you could use one," he said lightly. The gesture shouldn't have meant much, it was just coffee, but I felt my chest tighten as I accepted it. We didn't linger. We didn't talk about the night before. But in that small exchange, in that passing of the cup, I felt the thread between us pull taut again. At home, my husband asked how the coffee at work was, a casual joke he'd made before. I laughed, but it came out awkward, forced. He didn't seem to notice. That night, as I folded laundry, I thought about how easy it would be to stop, to cut off the overtime, to avoid the dinners, to step back. And yet, the thought of stopping made something inside me ache in a way I didn't want to look at too closely. Lying in the dark again, I realized the truth. This wasn't about one kiss anymore. It wasn't about a moment under the rain. It was about the way my life had begun to tilt, about the quiet hunger I hadn't acknowledged in years. I told myself again that nothing more would happen. I wanted to believe it. But deep down, I already knew the ground beneath me was shifting, and I wasn't sure I could, or even wanted to, find my balance again. The invitation came on a Thursday afternoon, slid into conversation as easily as a passing comment, but it stuck in my mind like a hook. "We've got that presentation out of town next week," he said, standing in the doorway of my office, a stack of folders under his arm. "I'd like you to come along. It'll be easier with someone who knows the numbers." His tone was casual, professional, but there was a trace of something beneath it, something I felt but couldn't quite name. I nodded, my hands still poised over the keyboard. "Of course," I replied, my voice even, though my stomach fluttered. Out-of-town trips weren't unheard of for my position, but they were rare, and they carried a weight that felt different from staying late at the office or grabbing dinner near work. A trip was time outside our usual world: hotel rooms, conference halls, long drives. It wasn't just work. It couldn't be. That night, at home, I mentioned the trip while slicing vegetables for dinner. My husband stood at the counter, peeling an apple with slow, precise movements. "It's only one night," I said, trying to make it sound like nothing, like routine. He nodded, the same way he always did, a small dip of the head that felt like both consent and distance. "Take my suitcase," he said, not looking up. "The wheels on yours squeak." That small offer, that shared familiarity, should have grounded me. Instead, it left me with a quiet guilt I couldn't shake. The days leading up to the trip passed with an odd tension, like the moment before a storm when the air is too still. At work, we didn't speak of it again, not directly. He handed me an itinerary, brief and to the point. "Meetings at 9 and 2, he said. "We'll be back by Friday night." His words were stripped of everything but logistics. But when his eyes met mine, they held something the words didn't. The morning of the trip, I packed carefully, choosing simple clothes, nothing too bright, nothing that might invite comment. Even as I folded blouses and tucked them into neat corners, I felt a weight in my chest, a whisper of anticipation I didn't want to name. The drive was long enough to blur the edges of my thoughts. The road stretched out in quiet gray lines, and the rain that had threatened all morning finally fell, tapping against the windshield in a soft, steady rhythm. He drove, one hand on the wheel, the other resting lightly near the gear shift, his fingers drumming now and then. We talked about the presentation first, about numbers and slides and questions that might come up. But as the miles passed, the conversation slipped into lighter things. Music. Old jobs we both hated. The food at the rest stops we passed. It wasn't flirtation, not in words, but there was something in the ease, in the quiet laughs that felt like something more. By the time we arrived in the small city where the meeting would be held, the rain had stopped. The hotel was unremarkable, a chain, clean and bland, the kind of place that leaves no memory. We checked in, the receptionist handing over keys with a polite smile, and then we went our separate ways to freshen up before dinner. Alone in the room, I stood by the window, looking out at the parking lot. The room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. I unpacked slowly, smoothing out wrinkles in my blouse, lining up toiletries on the counter. Every movement felt deliberate, though there was nothing to prepare for, not really. Dinner was at a small restaurant he'd found on his phone, just a few blocks away. We walked there, the sky darkening as we went, the air cool against my face. Inside, the place was quiet, the lighting soft. The tables were close enough to make the space feel intimate, though I doubted that was intentional. The conversation flowed easily again, as if we had both agreed without words to keep things light. But there were moments, small pauses, a glance held a beat too long, that made my pulse quicken. I laughed at one of his stories, and for a moment, I forgot to feel guilty. Then, in the middle of that comfort, something jarred. A familiar voice cut through the murmur of the restaurant. I turned my head just enough to see someone from our office, seated a few tables away. A colleague. Not close, but close enough to recognize us. Our eyes met briefly, just long enough for me to see the flicker of surprise, the slight tilt of the head that said, "What are they doing here together?" The rest of the dinner felt sharper, every word edged with the awareness of that presence. When we left, I could feel eyes on us, and I kept my expression neutral, careful. The walk back to the hotel was quiet. The air felt heavier now, though the rain hadn't returned. In the lobby, we paused by the elevators, the moment stretching just long enough for me to wonder if he would say something, anything, about what we'd just experienced. He didn't. He simply pressed the button for his floor, nodded once, and said, "Good night." Big day tomorrow. I nodded back, stepping into the elevator for my own floor. Good night. In the silence of my room, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my suitcase, at the neat row of shoes I'd lined up by the wall. I thought of the colleague in the restaurant, of that startled look. I thought of the way my laughter had come too easily, the way my shoulders had felt lighter at dinner. I lay down, the hotel sheets crisp beneath me, and stared at the ceiling in the dim light. The trip was supposed to be simple, a presentation, a few meetings, and home again. But as I closed my eyes, I knew nothing about this felt simple anymore. The morning after that dinner began with the shrill buzz of the hotel alarm clock and the flat light of a gray sky pressing through the curtains. I sat up slowly, feeling the unfamiliar stiffness of the mattress and the kind of exhaustion that isn't from lack of sleep but from too many unspoken things. I could still see the colleague's face in the restaurant from the night before, that flicker of recognition, the unspoken question that hung between us: what were they doing here together? I tried to push the thought aside as I got ready, focusing on the neat arrangement of my toiletries, unzipping my suitcase for the meeting that awaited. But every movement felt heavier than it should, my hands clumsy, my mind circling back to that one look across the restaurant and how it could unravel so much if it were mentioned to the wrong person. Downstairs, the conference room smelled faintly of coffee and carpet cleaner. We went through the motions of professionalism, the slide decks, the greetings, the carefully measured words. He stood at the podium, his voice steady and confident, while I handed out papers and nodded in the right places. To anyone else, it was an ordinary work trip. To me, it was a performance with stakes I didn't dare name out loud. The meetings stretched on, one blending into the next, and by the time the final handshake was done and the last folder was closed, it felt like the day had consumed every ounce of energy I had left. But there was no time to collapse into that exhaustion. We still had the drive home ahead of us. We stopped for dinner on the way back, a diner just off the highway with neon lights buzzing faintly against the dark. The place was nearly empty, the smell of fried food thick in the air. We chose a booth in the back, away from the windows, and for the first time since the morning, there was no one watching, no colleague at a nearby table, no forced politeness for strangers. We sat in that booth longer than we needed to. The conversation started with the day's events, the questions from clients, the technical glitch that nearly derailed the presentation, but it didn't stay there. Slowly, it shifted, as it always seemed to do with us. We spoke about travel, about childhood vacations, about places we'd only seen on postcards. I laughed at something he said, not a loud laugh, just a soft one, and it felt almost dangerous, the way that simple sound felt like loosening a knot. When we finally left, the parking lot was empty, the night air cool against my skin. We stood by our cars for a moment, neither of us moving. The silence stretched, not awkward, but not simple either. And then, it happened again. We kissed. There were no excuses this time, no rain to blame or closeness under an awning. It wasn't rushed or stolen in passing. It was deliberate, quiet, and it left no room for pretending it hadn't meant something. When it ended, there was no discussion, no analysis. We simply parted, got into our cars, and began the drive back as if nothing had happened. But inside, nothing felt untouched. The highway stretched on, the headlights of other cars streaking by like fleeting thoughts. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my mind a storm of feelings I couldn't fully sort. I wasn't just thinking about the kiss. I was thinking about the why. I thought of my husband waiting at home, probably on the couch with a book or watching a late-night show. I thought of how he'd looked at me the night I told him about this trip, calm, unbothered, unaware. And I thought of how I hadn't felt a single jolt of anticipation for anything in our life together in years, how that quiet had once been comforting but now felt like a suffocating kind of stillness. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the house was dark. The porch light glowed softly, and inside, I found him asleep in his chair, a blanket pulled over his knees. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him breathe, that familiar rise and fall that had been part of my life for decades. I wanted to feel only guilt. I wanted that guilt to be enough to wash everything else away. But it wasn't. Instead, there was a complicated mix of sorrow, longing, and an ache I couldn't quite name. Later, lying in our bed, staring at the faint outline of the ceiling fan above me, I thought about the diner booth, the way our words had come easier there than they had at my own kitchen table. I thought about how my life seemed to be splitting, not into chaos, not yet, but into two quiet, parallel lines, and how every day it felt like they were drifting further apart. I told myself, again, that this had to stop, that I could make it stop. But even as I whispered that promise to myself in the dark, another truth sat there too, unspoken but undeniable: I didn't want to. The week after that second kiss carried a different weight, like I was walking with something fragile balanced in my hands, terrified it might fall and shatter. The office looked the same desks, same coffee machine with its faint metallic smell, but everything felt slightly off-kilter, like the floor beneath me wasn't steady. The colleague who had seen us at the restaurant drifted into my thoughts more often than I wanted. I wondered what they thought, if they had told anyone, if their silence was a choice or simply indifference. Every time they passed my desk, I felt the faintest prickle on the back of my neck, as though I were being measured, considered. I noticed my husband noticing me in small, unsettling ways. He had always been an easy man to live beside, calm, slow to anger, not the type to pry. But now his eyes lingered longer when I came in late, his questions carried a pause that hadn't been there before. "Busy day?" he asked one evening, his tone light, but the space between the words felt heavier. I gave answers that felt rehearsed even as I spoke them, lines I could deliver on autopilot. The words filled the silence, but they didn't erase the feeling that he sensed something was off. At work, the tension took on a new texture. He and I didn't stop talking, but there was an added caution to our exchanges. He kept his office door open more often. When he passed papers to me, his fingers no longer brushed mine by accident, or maybe he made sure they didn't. Still, the connection hadn't dimmed. If anything, the restraint only sharpened it. Every shared glance, every quick smile in passing carried more meaning than it should have. One afternoon, I caught him leaning over the copier, sleeves rolled as usual, his hair slightly disheveled from running his hand through it. He looked up, and for a split second, there was no one else in the world. The moment was small, invisible to anyone around us, but it landed like a stone in my chest. The colleague, always there on the edges, chose that same week to start asking harmless questions. In the break room, they mentioned the trip casually, their voice light but their eyes steady. "How was that presentation?" they asked, stirring sugar into their tea. "Long drive, wasn't it?" I answered with the calmest voice I could muster, but I could feel the blood rise in my face, a warmth I couldn't control. It wasn't what they said, it was the way they said it. By Thursday, I found myself watching every word, every gesture. I laughed too brightly at an unrelated joke, nodded too quickly when someone made a suggestion in a meeting. I was trying to blend in, and in doing so, I probably stood out more. That evening, as I left the office later than most, he caught up to me near the parking lot. "We need to be careful," he said quietly, his voice low but steady. "I know," I answered. The exchange was brief, barely a conversation, but it sat with me the whole drive home. At the house, the lights were already on. My husband was at the table with a mug of tea, a magazine spread open but unread. He looked up when I came in, studied me for a second longer than he needed to. "You've been working late a lot," he said, not accusing, not even questioning, just stating. "Yes," I replied, my voice even, and moved toward the kitchen. That night, I sat on the edge of the bed after brushing my teeth, staring at the pattern of the carpet, listening to him set his book down on the nightstand. The quiet between us wasn't new. But it felt different now, stretched tighter, like a rope beginning to fray. The next day at work, I caught sight of the colleague again. Their gaze lingered on me, on him, and I realized then how fragile the boundary between us and exposure really was. Back at home, I told myself again and again that I could stop this. That I could step back, smooth everything over, and pretend none of it had ever happened. But even as I whispered those promises into the dark, I knew the truth. Something had already shifted too far to simply push back into place. The ground under me wasn't solid anymore, and every day it seemed to tilt just a little more. The day the third trip was announced, it felt almost ordinary at first. It was late in the afternoon, the office half empty, the low hum of printers and phones winding down. He leaned against my desk, holding a file. "We've been asked to meet with the partners again," he said, his voice level, almost casual. "It's last minute. Tonight, if we can manage it." I stared at him for a moment longer than I should have, the words sinking in slowly. Another trip. Another night away. I nodded, my throat dry. "I can pack quickly," I said, as if my agreement was automatic, like signing a receipt without reading it. At home, I told my husband the basics. "There's another meeting," I said, slipping shoes into a bag. They couldn't push it. He stood by the counter, slicing bread with a deliberate, steady hand. He didn't say much, just nodded, like he always did, but there was a pause that felt heavier this time, a pause that made me wish he'd ask me to stay. The drive out of town was longer than the others, the sun setting before we reached the outskirts. The radio played low in the background, but most of the drive was filled with silence, and not an uncomfortable one, just a silence where too many thoughts existed, unspoken. I glanced out the window often, watching the highway lights stretch into lines. When we arrived, the hotel lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and something floral. The receptionist smiled too brightly, her voice soft as she explained, "There's only one room left tonight. 2 beds, but only one room." I felt my pulse jump, though I didn't let it show. I glanced at him, but his expression didn't change, calm, neutral, as if he hadn't registered the implication at all. "That'll be fine," he said simply, taking the key. The room was as plain as every other, 2 narrow beds, a desk, curtains drawn tight. I set my bag down on one bed and smoothed the blanket, though there was nothing to smooth. The meeting that night was short, almost perfunctory, and we returned to the room earlier than expected. He sat at the desk, checking emails, while I unpacked toiletries and lined them neatly on the bathroom counter. The air between us felt different, not charged like an argument, not heavy like guilt, but different in a way that couldn't be ignored. Later, we both reached for the room's single extra blanket at the same time. Our hands brushed. We looked at each other. And that was it. We spent the night together. The morning came, as it always does, with its own clarity. The light through the curtains was pale and unforgiving, showing every crease in the sheets, every untouched corner of the room. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the carpet pattern, feeling a weight in my chest that wasn't just from lack of sleep. The drive home was quiet. We spoke about logistics, emails, deadlines, next week's schedule, but the words felt hollow, placeholders for the things we didn't say. When I pulled into my driveway, the house looked the same as always. The porch light glowed, the curtains were drawn, the familiar shape of my life waiting behind the door. Inside, my husband was reading in his chair, glasses low on his nose. He looked up when I entered, his eyes soft but searching. "You're back early," he said. "Yes," I answered. I set my bag by the stairs, the strap slipping from my shoulder. My hands felt too still. That night, lying in bed, I stared into the dark and thought about how there would be no going back now, not really. The things I'd crossed couldn't be uncrossed. The lines I'd blurred couldn't be made sharp again. And for the first time, I wondered, not just if I could keep this secret, but if I even wanted to. The morning after we returned, the house felt unfamiliar, as if I had stepped into someone else's life instead of my own. The air smelled of coffee and toast, but even those simple scents felt hollow, like props in a play. My husband sat at the table, reading, his glasses perched low on his nose. He looked up when I entered, offering the faintest smile, the kind that barely moved his mouth. "Sleep well?" he asked. I nodded, setting my bag down by the door. My voice felt strange when I replied, "Yes, thank you." The lie was too easy, too practiced. The day unfolded the way days do, emails, errands, chores. But there was an undercurrent I couldn't shake. The memory of the hotel room followed me like a shadow, quiet but insistent. Every ordinary thing, a folded towel, the smell of soap, seemed to carry its echo. At work, I noticed how quickly I checked for his presence. His door was open when I arrived, his voice carrying down the hallway as he greeted someone on the phone. There was nothing unusual in it, but my pulse still quickened at the sound. We didn't speak much that morning, only what was necessary. I handed him a stack of reports. He passed back a folder with corrections. But there were small things, always small things. The way his fingers brushed the edge of the paper, the pause before he thanked me. The colleague who had seen us at the restaurant weeks ago walked past my desk twice that day, each time with a glance that lingered just long enough to make my skin prickle. I couldn't tell if it was curiosity, suspicion, or nothing at all. But it was enough to make me hyper-aware of every movement. At home that evening, my husband asked an innocent question. "How was the trip?" he said, standing at the sink. The question should have been harmless, but it landed with the weight of an accusation. "Fine," I answered quickly. "Busy. Productive." He nodded, but his eyes stayed on me a moment longer than usual. That night, lying in bed, I watched him reading under the glow of the bedside lamp. His face was calm, untroubled, but there was something in his stillness that felt almost like distance. Or maybe it was my own guilt shaping what I saw. The next few days blurred together. I went through the motions, but I felt as if I was carrying two lives at once, each pressing against the other. One was visible, the wife who worked late, who cooked dinner, who folded laundry. The other was quiet but constant, a thread that tied me to something I didn't name out loud. He sent me a message one afternoon. Just one line, "Are you okay?" I stared at it longer than I should have before replying, "Yes. Just tired." It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. By the end of the week, I started noticing the changes in myself. How I dressed, how I spoke, how I smiled at things I wouldn't have smiled at before. It wasn't dramatic, but it was there, subtle shifts that I couldn't undo. My husband noticed too, in his own quiet way. He didn't ask questions outright, but his gaze lingered more often, his silences felt heavier. One evening, as I put away groceries, he asked if I'd like to take a weekend trip together, just the two of us. The words caught me off guard. I smiled and said, "That would be nice." But the truth was complicated. I thought about the hotel room, about the choices I had made and the ones I hadn't yet faced. I thought about how easy it had been to let things slide, one small decision at a time, until I had crossed a line I could never uncross. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet breathing beside me. The house was still, the street outside empty, but my thoughts wouldn't rest. I wondered, for the first time in a clear, undeniable way, what would happen when the two lives I'd been living finally collided. Because deep down, I knew they would. The message I had been dreading wasn't a text or an email. It came in the form of a single conversation I didn't hear, but I felt its echo the moment it began. It was late afternoon when I saw the colleague from the restaurant standing near my husband's car in the parking lot outside the office. I couldn't hear their words, just the cadence of voices, the colleague's polite but deliberate tone, my husband's low responses. From the distance, it looked like nothing, two people exchanging pleasantries. But something in the way the colleagues' hands moved as they spoke, the slight frown on my husband's face, told me this wasn't small talk. By the time I reached the parking lot, they were gone. My husband stood by his car, looking down at his phone as if it could offer him answers. When he saw me, his expression didn't change, not anger, not accusation, just a stillness that felt worse. The ride home that night was quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't come from comfort. I talked about work, about how the meeting had gone, about an article I'd read online. My words felt like paper-thin distractions. He listened, nodded occasionally, but didn't really respond. At dinner, the silence thickened. The clinking of utensils on plates became unbearably loud. He asked one question halfway through the meal, was the trip long? Yes, I said. That was the end of it. I couldn't stop replaying the image of that parking lot in my head. Had the colleague said everything? Or just enough to plant doubt? The next morning, I felt it the moment I stepped into the kitchen. He was there, pouring coffee, his face calm but unreadable. He handed me a cup, his eyes briefly meeting mine, and I felt an unfamiliar chill run through me. At work, nothing outwardly changed. The office hummed along as it always did, phones ringing, printers jamming. But the colleague avoided my gaze now, and that avoidance said more than words. He, the man who had started all of this, noticed too. He leaned on my desk late that afternoon, voice low. Is everything all right? Yes, I answered automatically. But it wasn't. I went home that evening braced for questions, but none came. My husband didn't confront me, didn't accuse, didn't raise his voice. Instead, there was a silence that cut deeper. He moved around the house with deliberate calm, setting his book on the table, folding his sweater over the back of a chair. I watched him carefully, wondering if he was waiting for me to speak first. That night, in bed, I lay awake while he slept. I thought about the colleague, about their choice to speak, about how a single conversation could unwind months of careful pretending. The following days stretched long, each one threaded with unease. At home, my husband's eyes lingered longer, his silences grew heavier. At work, the man I had crossed lines with seemed suddenly uncertain, his words more cautious. By Thursday, the weight of it all pressed on me so hard I could feel it in my chest. He asked me to step into his office that afternoon. He didn't close the door, but his voice was low. Maybe we should slow down, he said, the words sounding foreign in his mouth, hesitant. I stood there, nodding, my hands clasped tightly in front of me. The thought of stopping should have brought relief. Instead, it landed like a blow. When I left his office, the hallway felt longer than it ever had, each step echoing in the space around me. At home, my husband asked about my day, his tone steady but distant. Fine, I said. The lie tasted bitter, but the truth would have shattered everything. That night, I sat on the edge of the bed long after the lights were off, staring at my hands, at the quiet room around me. I had thought, in some unspoken way, that I could keep my lives separate. That I could manage the balance if I was careful enough. But that balance was gone now, and I could feel it, everything I'd been holding together was beginning to tilt, and there was no stopping it from falling. The morning after that conversation, the house felt heavier than ever. I woke before the alarm, lying still in the dim light as I listened to the sounds of my husband moving through the kitchen, mugs clinking softly, the kettle whistling. These were the same sounds I'd heard for years, but they didn't feel the same anymore. It was as if the air itself had thickened, making every breath deliberate. I walked into the kitchen and found him standing by the window, a mug in his hand. He didn't greet me right away, just looked outside for a long moment before turning. Coffee's ready, he said, his voice calm. Too calm. I poured myself a cup, the spoon clinking against the side as I stirred. Neither of us said much. The silence between us wasn't just empty space anymore, it was a living thing, growing, pressing against us. At work, the day moved like molasses. The office buzzed with its usual rhythms, phones ringing, keyboards tapping, but I felt like I was behind glass, watching it all from a distance. He barely looked at me. When he did, the glances were fleeting, polite, stripped of anything that might hint at what we had shared. I thought about what he'd said, asterisk maybe we should slow down, asterisk the words had hung in the air like a closing door. I told myself it was for the best, that maybe this was the moment to pull back, to repair what I could. But even as I tried to believe that, there was a hollow ache inside me, a quiet grief for something I wasn't sure I even had the right to grieve. By the time I drove home, the sun was setting. The sky was streaked with the colors of a fading day, pale orange, deepening blue, and for a moment I just sat in the driveway, hands on the steering wheel, staring at the house. Inside, the living room lights were on. My husband was sitting in his chair, his book open but unread. He looked up when I entered, studying me for a long second. There was no confrontation, no raised voice, no demand for answers. Instead, he simply said, "You're home." "Yes," I replied, setting my bag down by the door. My voice sounded strange, almost like it belonged to someone else. I made dinner, my hands moving automatically, chopping, stirring, plating. He helped quietly, passing me utensils, setting the table. We moved around each other the way we always had, but it felt like we were actors following stage directions, our lines memorized but empty. Over dinner, the only sounds were the scrape of forks and the soft hum of the refrigerator. He asked one question, "Busy day?" And I gave one answer, "Yes." That was all. Afterward, we sat in the living room, the television on but neither of us really watching. The silence wasn't loud, but it was unrelenting, filling every corner of the room. Later, upstairs, I stood at the bathroom sink brushing my teeth, staring at my reflection. My face looked the same eyes, same mouth, but I didn't feel the same. I thought about the months leading up to this moment, about the slow drift from one life into another. I remembered the first late night at the office, the brush of a hand. I remembered the rain under the awning, the restaurant booth, the hotel room. Each moment had felt small at the time, like pebbles tossed into water. But now, standing there, I could see the waves they'd made. When I climbed into bed, my husband was already there, lying on his side, his back to me. I turned off the lamp, and the room sank into darkness. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to his breathing. My thoughts felt like they were unraveling, a tangled thread I couldn't gather. I realized there wouldn't be some dramatic reckoning, no shouting match or slammed doors. What lay between us wasn't loud, it was quiet, but it was powerful. I also realized something else, something I hadn't wanted to face until now. I had betrayed him long before the kiss, before the trip, before the night in the hotel. The betrayal had started in smaller ways, silent wishes, unspoken longings, the moment I stopped turning toward him and started turning away. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if there would be forgiveness, or if I even deserved it. I didn't know if I would choose to stay, or if I already had one foot out the door. But I knew one thing for certain, nothing would ever be the same. I lay awake long after his breathing evened out, staring into the dark, waiting for a clarity that didn't come.